What if I told you that one of the greatest Ferraris ever built wasn't just beaten on track? It was erased by a rule change. Not because it was unreliable, not because it was unsafe, but because it threatened to tilt the balance of power in endurance racing so violently that the sport itself blinked first. Look, motorsport has always been a battle between innovation and regulation. Engineers push, officials pull back. But every now and then, a car comes along that pushes so hard, so fast, that the rulemakers don't just tweak the limits, they redraw the battlefield. And the Ferrari 512S, that was one of those cars. This is Motorsport Heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about the golden era of endurance racing and the machines that nearly broke it. If you're someone who loves deep dives into legendary race cars, engineering battles, and the politics behind the podium, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing. Most people remember the Porsche 917 when they think about 1970. The posters. The Gulf livery. Steve McQueen. But here's what most people don't realize. Ferrari's 512S was built with one clear objective: to destroy the 917's momentum and reclaim endurance racing supremacy. Not politely, not gradually, completely. To understand why the 512S mattered so much, we need to rewind to 1968 and 1969. Ford had humiliated Ferrari at Le Mans 4 consecutive times. Porsche was rising rapidly, and the FIA introduced a regulation that, on paper, seemed harmless. Manufacturers could run 5.0-liter engines in Group 5 if they built at least 25 identical cars. Now, you might be thinking, 25 cars? That doesn't sound outrageous. But in 1969, building 25 purpose-built prototypes wasn't just ambitious. It was financially insane. According to Porsche's own historical archives, the 917 program cost roughly 20 million Deutsche Marks, about $50 million in today's money, for 25 cars. That's like building 25 Formula One cars from scratch with no cost cap. The FIA assumed only lightly modified production cars would qualify. They underestimated pride and rivalry. Porsche moved first, stunning inspectors by presenting 25 complete 917s in April 1969. Ferrari couldn't afford to sit still. But here's where it gets really interesting. Ferrari had just sold 50% of the company to Fiat. Suddenly, Enzo Ferrari had access to industrial-level funding. The 512S wasn't just a race car. It was Fiat-backed vengeance. Under the skin, the 512S was a technical statement. A 4,993 cubic centimeters V12. Dual overhead cams per bank. 4 valves per cylinder. Around 550 horsepower at 8,500 revolutions per minute in 1970. To put that in perspective, most road cars at the time struggled to make 300 horsepower. Even many Formula One cars weren't dramatically more powerful. And this wasn't peaky, unusable power. Drivers described the 512S as surprisingly progressive, more controllable than the early 917s, which were infamous for high-speed instability. Think of the Porsche as a sledgehammer. The Ferrari was a scalpel that could still punch like a heavyweight. At Le Mans in 1970, these cars were hitting over 210 miles per hour on the Mulsanne Straight. Let that sink in. 210 miles per hour on a public road section with minimal runoff. According to period timing data, average lap speeds exceeded 150 miles per hour for 24 straight hours. This is where the analogy hits. Imagine 2 commercial airliners racing 10 feet above a highway, weaving through traffic for an entire day. That's the level of kinetic energy we're talking about. And the arms race escalated quickly. Aerodynamics evolved mid-season. Long-tail versions appeared to reduce drag. Cooling systems were reworked to handle brutal temperatures. Tire manufacturers like Firestone and Goodyear entered their own quiet war, developing compounds capable of surviving sustained 200-plus mile runs. But speed wasn't the only issue. Money was. Running a competitive 512S required factory-level support, specialized tools, constant gearbox rebuilds, engine refreshes. Ferrari built 25 chassis to meet homologation, but campaigning them properly demanded millions more. Contemporary reports estimate top teams were spending the equivalent of several $1,000,000 per season, numbers that rivaled Formula One budgets of the time. Here's what most people don't realize. The 25-car rule didn't democratize racing. It did the opposite. It locked out smaller manufacturers and serious privateers. You either had a 512S or a 917, or you were racing for third. And endurance racing, historically, wasn't supposed to work that way. Look, endurance racing thrived on diversity. Different engines, different philosophies. The possibility that clever strategy could beat raw speed. But by 1970, it was becoming a two-manufacturer arms race with everyone else as spectators. Now, you might be thinking, wasn't the real issue safety? Yes, but safety was the symptom. The deeper problem was sustainability. The FIA saw spiraling costs, escalating speeds, and dwindling competitive variety. And officials understood something critical. If this continued, only the wealthiest manufacturers could survive. The championship would collapse into an industrial Cold War. So for 1972, the governing body made a decision that would reshape endurance racing. They reduced the prototype engine limit from 5.0 liters to 3.0 liters. Overnight, the 512S was obsolete. Not banned explicitly, just legislated into extinction. This is where it gets really interesting, because Ferrari hadn't failed. The car hadn't been outclassed permanently. It had been regulated out because it succeeded too well at what it was built to do. Think about that. A machine so capable that the sport itself had to change. And that raises a bigger question. Was the 512S a victim of its own brilliance? Or proof that unlimited competition inevitably eats itself alive? In the next section, we're going to break down exactly how the 512S performed on track, what its evolution into the 512M revealed about Ferrari's desperation to win, and why even with all its potential, it struggled against the 917 in ways that surprised everyone. Short hook. What really happened when Ferrari unleashed the 512S at full power? Here's what most people don't realize. The Ferrari 512S wasn't just fast on paper, it was terrifyingly quick in race trim. But raw speed and championship dominance are not the same thing. And this is where the story gets complicated. Let's start with Sebring, March 1970. 12 hours, brutal heat. Concrete surface that punished suspension and brakes. Ferrari showed up with the 512S in full force, backed by factory support and heavy expectations. Porsche brought the 917, refined after a year of terrifying development. Now you might be thinking, if the Ferrari was so revolutionary, did it immediately start winning? Not quite. At Sebring, the 512S showed genuine pace. Mario Andretti famously put one on pole position with a lap record. Think about that. Brand new car, brand new program, and immediately at the front. That's like launching a startup and overtaking Apple in week 1. But endurance racing isn't about one flying lap. It's about surviving 12 or 24 hours of mechanical punishment. The 512S suffered from teething issues, gearbox fragility, brake wear, and fuel consumption challenges. The Porsche 917, meanwhile, had matured. It was still wild, but Porsche had ironed out enough weaknesses to convert speed into reliability. And reliability wins endurance races. According to period statistics from the 1970 World Sports Car Championship season, Porsche won 9 of 10 championship rounds. Ferrari's 512S managed only a single World Championship victory that year at Sebring's sister event in Austria, plus strong individual performances scattered across the calendar. That contrast matters. On sheer lap time, the Ferrari could challenge. Over distance, Porsche executed better. But here's where it gets really interesting. Ferrari didn't stand still. Midway through 1970, they evolved the car into the 512M, Modificata. And this wasn't cosmetic. Engineers revised aerodynamics, reworked the nose for better airflow, trimmed weight, and improved stability at high speed. The body became sleeker, more purposeful. If the original 512S was a heavyweight prizefighter, the 512M was leaner, sharper. Private teams like Nart and Scuderia Montjuic adopted the updated cars, and performance improved significantly. In 1971, the 512M started showing flashes of the dominance Ferrari had envisioned from the beginning. Faster lap times, better balance, more refined execution. But the clock was ticking. Because while Ferrari refined the 512, the FIA was already preparing the 3.0-liter regulation shift for 1972. Look, imagine spending years building the ultimate gaming PC, upgrading every component, finally eliminating all lag, and then the entire platform switches to a different operating system that makes your hardware incompatible. That's essentially what happened. Now let's talk about Le Mans 1970, the race everyone remembers. The Ferrari 512S entered in significant numbers. On paper, they had strength in depth. But Porsche's 917K, particularly in Gulf livery, proved devastatingly effective. Heavy rain turned the race into survival mode. Reliability and stability became everything. Of the 11 Ferraris entered, only a handful finished. Porsche locked out the top two positions. Ferrari's best 512S finished fourth overall. Here's the nuance most highlight reels ignore. The Ferrari wasn't dramatically slower. In qualifying, 512S cars were within seconds of the 917s. Over a single lap, the difference could be marginal. But endurance racing punishes small weaknesses repeatedly. Brake wear compounds. Gear stress multiplies. Cooling inefficiencies escalate. This is where it gets really interesting, because Ferrari's challenge wasn't just Porsche, it was internal philosophy. Enzo Ferrari historically prioritized engine brilliance. Chassis development sometimes lagged behind sheer power output. Porsche, by contrast, approached the 917 as a holistic system. Wind tunnel time, weight distribution, structural rigidity. According to Porsche development records, over 1,000 hours were spent refining 917 aerodynamics, after early instability issues. Ferrari's wind tunnel resources in 1970 were comparatively limited. Fiat's investment helped enormously, but Porsche had already endured its painful learning curve in 1969. By 1970, they were cashing in on that suffering. Now, you might be thinking, if the 512S wasn't consistently beating the 917, why did officials feel the need to change the rules? Because the concern wasn't who won one race. It was where the escalation would lead next. If Ferrari continued refining the 512M into 1972 and beyond, power outputs could have pushed past 600 horsepower. Aerodynamic experimentation was accelerating rapidly. Tire manufacturers were building compounds specifically for these extreme loads. Average speeds at Le Mans had already climbed dramatically, from around 130 miles per hour in the early 1960s to over 150 miles per hour by 1970. That trajectory was unsustainable. The FIA saw costs ballooning. According to contemporary financial analyses, top-level prototype campaigns by 1971 were consuming budgets equivalent to tens of millions in modern dollars annually. Smaller manufacturers like Alfa Romeo and Matra could not compete under a 5.0-liter arms race. The grid risked shrinking to Ferrari versus Porsche, and possibly neither if costs spiraled further. So the 3.0-liter cap wasn't just about slowing cars down. It was about resetting the ecosystem. And here's the irony: Ferrari adapted beautifully. The Ferrari 312 PB, built for the new 3.0-liter era, dominated the 1972 World Championship, winning 10 out of 11 races. That statistic is staggering. Once the playing field reset, Ferrari thrived again. But the 512S became a transitional titan. Too advanced for yesterday, misaligned with tomorrow. Here's what most people don't realize. The 512S also indirectly shaped modern endurance racing philosophy. The lesson learned was clear. Open-ended homologation formulas can create explosive innovation, but without cost controls and displacement limits, they inevitably narrow competition. Fast forward to today. Hypercar regulations, balance of performance systems, hybrid caps. They all trace philosophical DNA back to the late 1960s arms race. Governing bodies now intervene early, not late. They remember what happened when Ferrari and Porsche were given relatively open boundaries. And this is where it becomes almost poetic. The Ferrari 512S didn't dominate statistically. It didn't collect Le Mans trophies the way the 917 did. But its existence, its speed, its cost, its sheer escalation, helped force a structural reset that preserved endurance racing for decades to come. It was a catalyst car. Sometimes the most important machines aren't the ones that win the most. They're the ones that force the system to evolve. And today, surviving 512S examples are worth north of $10 to $15 million at auction. That's not just nostalgia pricing. That's recognition. Collectors understand that this car represents a fault line in motorsport history, the exact moment when freedom and control collided. When you stand next to one, it feels different. Long, low, impossibly wide. The V12 sits like coiled muscle under fiberglass skin. You don't just see engineering. You see escalation embodied in aluminum and steel. So was the Ferrari 512S too good for its own survival? In a way, yes. Not because it crushed everyone on track every weekend, but because it proved how far manufacturers were willing and able to go when pride, funding, and regulatory loopholes aligned. Short hook. But what did the drivers really think of this monster? Short hook. What did it actually feel like to drive something that could outrun its own era? Here's the thing. Statistics tell you how fast the car was. Drivers tell you how dangerous it felt. And when you talk to the men who strapped themselves into the Ferrari 512S in 1970 and 1971, a pattern emerges. Respect, awe, and just a hint of fear. Mario Andretti described the 512S as brutally quick but surprisingly refined compared to the early Porsche 917. That might sound like faint praise, but it's not. Early 917 test drivers reported terrifying high-speed lift. The rear end would go light at 200 miles per hour. One factory driver, John Wolfe, tragically lost his life at Le Mans in 1969 in a 917. Porsche responded with aerodynamic revisions that transformed the car into the stable 917K. Ferrari, by contrast, launched the 512S into competition without quite the same public drama. It was powerful, yes, around 550 horsepower in race trim. But the chassis balance was generally praised. Drivers said it communicated clearly at the limit. It didn't try to kill you unpredictably. Now, you might be thinking, 550 horsepower doesn't sound outrageous today. Look, context is everything. In 1970, the average family sedan made maybe 120 horsepower. Even high-performance road cars like the Lamborghini Miura produced around 350 horsepower. The 512S wasn't just more powerful. It was lighter and purpose-built. At roughly 1,800 to 1,900 pounds, depending on configuration, its power-to-weight ratio was comparable to many modern supercars. And there were no traction control systems, no ABS, no power steering, no carbon fiber crash structures. The driver's right foot was the only stability system. Here's what most people don't realize. Endurance racing drivers in that era weren't just managing speed. They were managing survival fatigue. Heart rate data from later studies of similar era race drivers show sustained heart rates between 160 and 180 beats per minute during stints. That's like running a half marathon, while making split-second decisions at 200 miles per hour. The Ferrari's cockpit was cramped and brutally hot. The V12 sat just inches behind the driver's back. Heat soak during long stints could push cockpit temperatures well above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Ventilation was minimal. Noise levels exceeded 120 decibels. That's jet engine territory. Imagine sitting in a metal drum, strapped in tight, with a mechanical symphony screaming behind your spine for 3 hours straight. Now add rain, nightfall, slower traffic, oil on the racing line. This is where it gets really interesting. Because despite the physical punishment, many drivers preferred the Ferrari's character over the Porsche's raw aggression. The 512S delivered its power more progressively. Period reports noted that throttle modulation was more intuitive. The Porsche 917, especially in its earlier form, could feel binary, either gripping or snapping. Ferrari's V12, with its smooth torque curve, allowed drivers to balance the car mid-corner with greater confidence. Confidence matters in endurance racing. A car that's slightly slower but predictable can ultimately be faster over 24 hours. But here's the contradiction. The Ferrari's relative civility didn't eliminate the underlying brutality of the era. Let's talk about braking. The 512S ran large ventilated disc brakes for its time, but stopping from over 200 miles per hour repeatedly pushed materials to their limits. Drivers reported noticeable brake fade during long runs. Pedal feel could change over a stint. That means recalibrating your braking points while approaching corners at aircraft takeoff speeds. Now, you might be thinking, weren't tracks safer back then? Not really. Runoff areas were limited. Barriers were often Armco steel or even just earth embankments. Medical response infrastructure was improving, but nowhere near modern standards. At Le Mans, the Mulsanne Strait was essentially a public road closed for racing. The margin for error was microscopic. And yet, there was something intoxicating about it. Drivers spoke of the 512S's V12 as almost orchestral at full song. At 8,000 plus RPM, it didn't just roar, it sang. 12 cylinders firing in perfect mechanical harmony. There's an emotional component here that's hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. This wasn't just speed, it was theater. Here's what most people don't realize. Many of these drivers raced in multiple categories simultaneously. Formula One one weekend, endurance racing the next. Jackie Ickx, for example, balanced both disciplines. That meant shifting from a lightweight, twitchy F1 car to a 5.0-liter endurance missile within days. Adaptability was survival. And then there was traffic management. At Le Mans, the speed differential between prototypes like the 512S and GT cars could approach 80 to 100 miles per hour on the straights. Closing speeds like that compress reaction time dramatically. Modern data analysis shows that at a 100 miles per hour closing differential, drivers have less than 3 seconds to assess, position, and execute a safe pass before overlap. 3 seconds. At night, in the rain. With fatigue setting in. This is where the driver's praise for the 512S stability becomes crucial. A twitchy car at those speeds multiplies risk exponentially. Ferrari's chassis engineers may not have had Porsche's wind tunnel depth, but they produced a platform drivers trusted. But trust doesn't equal invincibility. Mechanical failures still haunted the 512S gearboxes in particular, were under enormous strain. Imagine transmitting 550 horsepower through a 5-speed manual gearbox for 24 hours, with aggressive downshifts and constant load changes. Even reinforced components have limits. Drivers sometimes describe nursing the car late in races, short shifting, easing braking zones, listening for subtle mechanical changes. Endurance racing wasn't flat-out sprinting. It was controlled aggression. Now here's where it gets almost philosophical. The 512S demanded partnership. It wasn't a car you dominated. It was a machine you negotiated with. Push too hard, and it punished you. Respect its limits, and it rewarded you with extraordinary pace. That dynamic shaped how drivers approached the era's escalating speeds. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because even as drivers mastered these monsters, governing bodies were realizing that human adaptability had limits. Reaction times don't evolve as fast as horsepower. Physical endurance doesn't scale with aerodynamic efficiency. The Ferrari 512S existed right at that threshold, the point where engineering began outpacing human margin. Drivers loved it, feared it, respected it. But even the bravest among them understood something fundamental. If this trajectory continued unchecked, 600 horsepower, 220 miles per hour averages, escalating aerodynamic loads, the consequences would eventually become catastrophic. So when the FIA introduced the 3.0-liter rule for 1972, many drivers privately acknowledged the logic. Publicly, racers hate restrictions. Privately, they understand physics. The 512S wasn't just a fast car, it was a signal flare. A warning shot that the sport was accelerating faster than its safety net. And yet, ask anyone who drove one whether they'd erase the experience from their life. Not a chance. Short hook. So what happened to the survivors? Short hook. What becomes of a monster when the battlefield disappears? Here's the thing. When the FIA pulled the plug on the 5.0-liter era after 1971, the Ferrari 512S didn't just quietly retire. It entered a strange in-between existence, too advanced for yesterday's rules, incompatible with tomorrow's formula, and too expensive to casually repurpose. And this is where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't Ferrari just redesign the car for the new 3.0-liter regulations? Not realistically. The 512S was engineered around its massive V12. Its weight distribution, cooling architecture, chassis stiffness, and aerodynamics were all optimized for a 5.0-liter engine, producing well over 500 horsepower. Dropping in a smaller engine wouldn't just reduce power. It would fundamentally destabilize the design philosophy. It would be like pulling the heart out of a heavyweight boxer and asking him to compete as a featherweight. The proportions don't translate. So Ferrari pivoted. They developed the 312 POBs for the new 3.0-liter prototype era. And here's what most people don't realize. The 312 POB went on to dominate the 1972 World Championship, winning 10 out of 11 races. Ferrari didn't fade away. They adapted instantly once the playing field reset. But the 512S? It became a relic almost overnight. Some chassis were sold to private teams. Others were converted to 512M specification in an attempt to extract final competitive life during the transition year of 1971. A handful migrated to the North American Can-Am series, where engine displacement limits were far more permissive. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Can-Am in the early 1970s was basically the Wild West of motorsport. Minimal restrictions. Massive power outputs, sometimes exceeding 1,000 horsepower in turbocharged applications. Compared to that insanity, the naturally aspirated 512S almost seemed restrained. But even there, it struggled to compete consistently against purpose-built Can-Am machinery like the Porsche 91710 and 91730, which evolved into turbocharged beasts. The Ferrari wasn't designed for that arms race. It had been built for endurance, not short-format power explosions. So gradually, the 512S transitioned from frontline weapon to historic artifact. And this is the part that fascinates me. Cars like the 512S weren't designed with nostalgia in mind. They were tools, disposable in the pursuit of victory. Yet today, surviving examples are among the most valuable race cars in existence. Auction data over the past decade shows Ferrari 512S and 512M models commanding prices between $8 million and $15 million, depending on provenance and originality. That's not speculative hype. That's recognition of significance. Because when collectors evaluate a car like the 512S, they're not just buying aluminum and fiberglass. They're buying a turning point. Here's what most people don't realize. Of the 25 chassis originally constructed to satisfy homologation requirements, fewer than that survive in fully authentic form. Racing attrition, modifications, crashes, and part swapping over decades mean true originality is rare. And provenance matters enormously. A chassis with documented factory backing or a major race history, Sebring, Daytona, Le Mans, can command exponentially higher valuations. In the collector world, paperwork can be as valuable as horsepower. But value isn't just financial. The 512S lives on in historic racing events like the Le Mans Classic and Monterey Historics, and here's the beautiful irony. Even today, event organizers often separate the 5.0-liter monsters into distinct run groups because they're simply faster than much of the surrounding period machinery. 50-plus years later, still too much car. Drivers who campaign these machines in vintage events describe them as physically demanding but remarkably communicative. Modern racing suits and safety systems help, of course, but the fundamental character remains intact. Heavy clutch, long gear throws, immense throttle sensitivity. No electronic safety nets. And the sound, that V12 howl, still stops people in their tracks. This is where it gets philosophical again. The 512S represents an era before motorsport became hyper-regulated by data analytics and balance of performance algorithms. Today, sanctioning bodies actively equalize competition to maintain tight racing. Performance windows are carefully engineered. Back then, parity was incidental, not manufactured. Now, you might be thinking, isn't modern racing better because it's closer? In many ways, yes. Closer racing can mean better spectacle. Lower costs can mean healthier grids. But here's the trade-off. We rarely see existentially dominant machines anymore. Cars that force the rulebook to change. Regulations today anticipate escalation before it spirals. The Ferrari 512S emerged in a loophole moment, a regulatory gray zone where ambition briefly outpaced oversight. And that's part of why it fascinates historians. It's not just a car, it's a case study in competitive escalation. Economists call it an arms race dynamic. One participant innovates aggressively. The rival responds. Costs rise. Risks increase. Eventually, a governing authority intervenes to prevent collapse. Sound familiar? The 512S versus 917 rivalry is motorsport's version of that principle in pure mechanical form. And here's something even deeper. Ferrari's identity as a brand was reinforced, not diminished, by the 512S chapter. Even though it didn't dominate the championship statistically, it demonstrated Ferrari's refusal to concede technological ground. Enzo Ferrari wasn't content to watch Porsche rewrite endurance racing unchallenged. He responded with scale, with fury, with 12 cylinders of defiance. That narrative matters. Modern Ferrari hypercars, the 499P for example, carry echoes of that mindset. Advanced hybrid systems, complex aerodynamics, and strategic adaptation to regulations. But now the battlefield is more controlled. The 512S was forged in comparative chaos. Here's what most people don't realize. The regulatory lessons learned in 1971 directly influenced how governing bodies structured prototype racing for decades. Engine displacement caps became standard. Homologation requirements tightened. Safety research accelerated. The shockwave of that era shaped everything from Group C in the 1980s to today's hypercar class. So when you see a 512S idling in a paddock today, understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the moment endurance racing hit its first modern speed ceiling. A machine that asked how fast is too fast, and forced officials to answer. And maybe that's why it still resonates. Because deep down, motorsport fans are drawn to edges, to the outer boundary where courage, engineering, and risk intersect. The 512S lived exactly on that boundary. It didn't die because it failed. It faded because it proved a point too clearly. Short hook. So what's the real legacy of the Ferrari 512S? Short hook. Did the Ferrari 512S lose the war, or redefine it? Look, when people rank the greatest endurance race cars of all time, the Porsche 917 usually sits near the top. It won Le Mans. It dominated championships. It has the Hollywood mythology. So where does that leave the Ferrari 512S? Here's what most people don't realize. Legacy isn't always measured in trophies. Sometimes it's measured in consequences. The 512S forced endurance racing to confront its own trajectory. It exposed the fragility of an open-ended homologation formula. It proved that when pride, corporate backing, and engineering freedom collide, escalation becomes inevitable. And that's the key word, inevitable. By 1971, prototype speeds had climbed to levels circuit infrastructure simply wasn't built to handle. According to historical FIA data, average speeds at Le Mans increased by roughly 20 miles per hour between the early 1960s and 1970. That kind of jump over less than a decade is enormous in motorsport terms. Think of it like compound interest. Each incremental gain builds on the last. Aerodynamics improve slightly. Tires get better. Engines produce another 30 horsepower. Multiply that across seasons, and suddenly you're 40 miles per hour faster at the end of the straight than you were 5 years ago. The Ferrari 512S lived at the sharp end of that curve. Now you might be thinking, wasn't innovation the whole point of prototype racing? Yes, absolutely. But here's the tension. Innovation without guardrails can price out participation. When Ferrari and Porsche were spending what would equate to tens of millions of dollars annually in today's terms, smaller manufacturers had two options: overextend financially or step aside. And many stepped aside. The FIA's shift to 3.0-liter prototypes in 1972 wasn't anti-innovation. It was recalibration. It lowered the financial and technical barrier to entry, and the results were immediate. In 1972 and 1973, the World Championship for makes featured a broader, competitive field. Ferrari, Matra, Alfa Romeo, all capable of winning races. The championship battles stretched deeper into the season. Here's where it gets really interesting. The racing arguably became more strategically complex. With less brute horsepower, efficiency mattered more. Aerodynamic balance, fuel management, tire preservation, these factors gained influence. Instead of pure top-speed warfare, teams optimized systems. In other words, the 512S era closed the door on one kind of excess and opened the door to a more sustainable technical evolution. But sustainability doesn't stir the soul the way excess does. And that's why the 512S still captures imagination. When you look at photos of it, low, wide, impossibly dramatic, you're seeing a machine unburdened by modern compromise. No balance of performance formulas. No hybrid deployment limits. No energy recovery allocation charts. Just displacement, combustion, and ambition. Here's the analogy I keep coming back to. The 512S was like the final year of an unregulated gold rush. Prospectors digging deeper, faster, riskier. Eventually, authorities imposed structure, not to kill the dream, but to prevent collapse. Now, let's address an objection directly. You might be thinking, if the 512S didn't win Le Mans, if it didn't dominate statistically, can we really call it too good? Fair question. But dominance isn't only about wins. It's about capability. Engineering reports from the period show that Ferrari's development curve with the 512M variant was steep. Aerodynamic refinements were closing stability gaps. Reliability improvements were underway. Given another full development cycle under stable regulations, it's entirely plausible Ferrari could have shifted the competitive balance. The rule change interrupted that trajectory. And that interruption is part of the car's mystique. It represents potential unrealized under frozen conditions. There's something almost cinematic about that, a technological crescendo cut short. And yet, Ferrari didn't crumble. They pivoted. The 312 Podobe era proved that Maranello could dominate within constraints just as effectively as outside them. So the 512S becomes something else entirely. A stress test. A mechanical experiment that revealed where the boundaries of endurance racing truly lay. Here's what most people don't realize. Modern hypercar regulations are intentionally designed to prevent another 512S scenario. Budget caps, homologation scrutiny, hybrid standardization, safety mandates, all calibrated to keep competition intense but contained. The governing bodies remember what unfettered escalation looks like. The 512S is part of that institutional memory. And emotionally, it represents a pure confrontation. Ferrari versus Porsche. 12 cylinders versus flat 12. National pride layered over corporate rivalry. Italian passion against German precision. It's Shakespeare with fuel injection. Today, when a 512S fires up at a historic event, the crowd reaction isn't just appreciation, it's reverence. Because people instinctively understand they're witnessing a relic from the edge. A time when engineers asked, "How far can we push this?" instead of, "How close can we stay to the performance window?" And maybe that's the real legacy. The Ferrari 512S reminds us that progress sometimes needs friction, that greatness can exist even without a trophy cabinet overflowing, that forcing a system to adapt is, in its own way, a form of victory. It didn't just compete. It compelled change. And in motorsport history, very few machines can claim that. So was the 512S unfairly regulated out of existence? Or was it the necessary sacrifice that allowed endurance racing to survive and evolve? That's the tension. That's the debate. And that's why, more than 50 years later, we're still talking about it. Because the Ferrari 512S wasn't simply a race car. It was a line in the sand.